Hello and welcome to Curated Conversations, brought to you by the Museum Studies and Cultural Heritage Management Programs and the Johns Hopkins University Office of Advanced Academic Programs. Today's event features Jordan Dresser and Shannon O'Loughlin discussing Bringing Home Chief Black Coal, Restitution and Repatriation. My name is Peter Huggins, and I'm the event producer. Please note, today's event will be recorded and uploaded to the AAP YouTube channel under the Curated Conversations playlist. During the program, if you have any questions, please feel free to use the Q&A function, and we'll answer as many questions as possible over the next hour. With that, I will turn the event over to the moderator of our program, Dr. Stephanie Brown, Assistant Director and Senior Lecturer for the Master of Arts in Museum Studies program.
Thank you, Peter, and welcome everyone. It's great to have you with us. Even though we can't see you, we can see your number, and we know that we're in a great group. It's so exciting for us in Museum Studies and Cultural Heritage to be joined by Jordan and Shannon tonight, who both bring important and distinct but overlapping perspectives to what continues to be an important and powerful issue in our field. In early 2020, Chief Black Coal's headdress came home to the Northern Arapaho Nation after spending a century stored in a New England attic. How it got there and how it came home is part of a larger story about the meanings of cultural heritage versus private property. Who owns the cultural material of Native nations across the United States? Who should care for it and how? What role do museums and historic sites play in Native or Indigenous heritage? And what should that role be? More than 3 decades after the passage of the Native American Graves Protection Repatriation Act, NAGPRA, these questions still provoke passionate engagement. Peter, can we go to the next slide? So this evening, we're joined by Jordan Dresser, Northern Arapaho, who is a documentary filmmaker and the former chairman of the Northern Arapaho Nation on the Wind River Reservation in Wyoming. He graduated from the University of Wyoming in 2008 with a Bachelor of Arts degree in journalism. He has worked as a reporter for the Lincoln Journal-Star, the Salt Lake Tribune, the Forum, and the Denver Post. Questions of who owns tribal artifacts and the role tribal members play in these decisions prompted Dresser to leave Wind River and earn an MA in Museum Studies at the University of San Francisco. Dresser has served as collections manager for the Northern Arapaho Tribal Historic Preservation Office in Riverton, Wyoming, and is currently at work on several documentary film projects. Past films include the 2016 award-winning documentary, What Was Ours?, The Art of Home, a Wind River Story from 2019, Home from School, The Children of Carlisle from 2021, and Who She Is from 2022. And joining Jordan, we have Shannon O'Loughlin, who is a citizen of the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma and the chief executive and attorney for the Association on American Indian Affairs, the oldest nonprofit serving Indian country. Shannon has been practicing law for more than 22 years and is a lecturer at Johns Hopkins University. She's former chief of staff to the National Indian Gaming Commission, where she assisted in the development and implementation of national policy throughout the agency and oversaw the agency's public affairs, technology, compliance, and finance divisions. Shannon has also served Indian country in the private sector as an attorney, leading a large national firm's Indian law practice group that worked to strengthen, maintain, and protect Native nation sovereignty, self-determination, and culture. Shannon was appointed by Secretary of the Department of the Interior, Sally Jewell, to the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act Review Committee in 2013, and was appointed by President Barack Obama as the first Native American to the Cultural Property Advisory Committee within the State Department in 2015. She was fired by President Trump in 2019. Shannon received a BA in American Indian Studies from California State University, Long Beach, and joint MA and JD degrees from the University of Arizona in Indigenous peoples' law and policy. So this is how we're going to go for the next hour or so. We have 3 amazing case studies to talk with you about, and Jordan is going to walk us through those case studies. One concerns repatriation restitution from a museum, another from the government, and another from a private collector. Shannon is going to be part of that conversation by talking with us about the way that the law is written and the way that policies have been enacted, followed, and sometimes ignored by organizations holding cultural heritage. At the end of their presentation, we should have about 20 minutes, 25 minutes for a broader conversation. And during that time, you should, in fact, at any time throughout the presentation, you should feel free to post your questions in the Q&A forum. And then we will go through as many of them as we can. And we look forward to having a rich and complicated and intricate conversation. Before we get started, though, I think it would be helpful for all of us if we build a little scaffold to talk about what we're talking about. So I've asked Shannon to talk with us about sort of the meaning and scope and history of NAGPRA, which of course is something that we could all spend the rest of the semester talking about, nothing else. But we're going to just give us a little grounding for the next hour, Shannon.
Thank you so much, Stephanie, and welcome everyone. I'm glad to join you today and glad to be in the same virtual room with Jordan, who is a strong advocate that all of us look up to in this work. So let's talk a little bit about the kind of legal scaffolding of what is repatriation. In addition to the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, there are probably about 25, maybe even 30 federal laws that apply to the management, the return, the protection, the excavation of Native cultural heritage. And those laws began in the early 1900s. Often were developed not to protect Native American rights to their own culture and heritage, but to protect the scientific field of archaeology and anthropology, to protect the scientific value of cultural heritage. Today, one of the most known pieces of legislation is the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, which was passed on November 16th, 1990. And it is considered a very strong human rights law, and one of the first human rights law to finally protect Native American nations and lineal descendants, protect their rights to their own cultural heritage that they've been dispossessed from, that has wound up in the hands of individuals and entities all over the world. The NAGPRA, what it does is it has 3 pieces to it, and I think it's important we understand those 3 pieces. We'll mainly focus on repatriation issues, but other issues in addition to repatriation that NAGPRA applies to are graves protection provisions, and graves protection provisions apply to only federal and tribal lands. Repatriation provisions apply to federal agencies and museums under the NAGPRA scheme are defined very broadly. So they're not your traditional museum, but really any institution that has a Native American collection and that has been in receipt of federal funds since 1990. Third part of NAGPRA is the criminal part about illegal trafficking. And the wonderful thing that Congress did with this legislation is it clearly stated the rights of Native peoples and Native nations to their cultural heritage by clearly defining what those items were, and that those items are community or communally held by nations, by communities, by bands, by families. And therefore, these aren't individual items that are part of the marketplace. They're not and were never meant to be pieces of art that were marketable and commodified to be bought and sold and traded. These items that NAGPRA specifically protects through its repatriation provisions, our ancestors, our native human remains, and there is no time stamp on those ancestors. Any ancestor that is found on within the United States, Alaska, and Hawaii is likely Native American, and this law applies to those ancestors. It also applies to their burial belongings or funerary objects, as well as sacred objects and objects of cultural patrimony. And those are the items that Congress has broadly declared no one else can have a right of possession to, unless they can prove that at the time of the taking of those items or those Native American bodies, that they had free, prior, and informed consent from the nation's governance, who had the authority to give that item or person to another. So even though Congress made a very broad declaration of policy, it only provided a remedy for what I call public hands and public lands. So the provisions of NAGPRA only apply to federal and tribal lands and federal agencies and museums receiving federal funding. So I think that's kind of a good broad spectrum of what NAGPRA is, and I'll turn it back over to you, Stephanie.
That's great. Thank you, Shannon. Thank you. So now I'm going to ask Jordan. Let's go back to the slides, Peter, if we can. I'm going to be personal for just a hot second here and say that I first knew Jordan about 10 years ago when he was studying in San Francisco. And let me be the first to say that I am not great with Western geography. And I was not sure for a long time exactly where Wyoming was. And after I figured out where Wyoming was, I still wasn't completely sure about where Wind River was. So can we have the next slide, Peter? That's where Wyoming is, and that's where Wind River is in the state of Wyoming. And Jordan, can you orient us geographically and sort of demographically to Wind River?
Yes, Wind River is the only reservation in Wyoming and is located in the central part of the state. And it's home to both the Northern Arapaho and the Eastern Shoshone tribes. Originally, with the 1868 treaty, it was guaranteed that the Shoshones were going to have their own. It was called the Warm Valley Reservation. And then the Northern Arapaho was going to be given one in the Colorado area, but that never materialized. And we ended up just calling this place home. But I think a key thing to talk about that, with location, especially with tribes, is the fact that, we have migratory pathways that don't just limit us to the reservation. So that's a very key thing, that especially when it comes to NAGPRA and different those things as well. Oral histories, which is history, dates us from here to Colorado, Nebraska, all the way up to the Great Lakes area. So that's the whole pathway that we claim as Northern Arapaho people as our migratory pathway.
Great, that's great. And then can we look at the next slide? And I think this is the town and the inset is Fort Washakie. Is that right? Do you think, Jordan?
Yes, that is Fort Washakie.
That is Fort Washakie.
Yep.
Washakie.
Yep. And the reservation is about 2.1 million acres, broken up into 3 different basically towns. You have Fort Washakie, which is predominantly Eastern Shoshone. You have Ethity, which means good in Arapaho, and that's predominantly a mixture. And then you have the town of Arapaho, which is predominantly Arapaho. But those are the main 3 areas that encompass with the borders of it.
Great. Thank you. So I hope that gives you kind of a sense of at least where we're starting tonight. And let's go to the next slide. So this is the first case study we're going to look at is museum restitution, and it's to do with work that Jordan and his colleagues have done with the field museum. So Jordan, I'm gonna step back and let you tell the story.
Well, my first history with the Field Museum dates back to 2011, 2012. I was part of a documentary film called What Was Ours, and we traveled to the Chicago Field Museum to see items that belong to the Northern Arapaho and Eastern Shoshone people. And they allowed us to take 360 shots of of a select group of items. And we had Arapaho and Shoshone elders speak in also Arapaho and Shoshone and in Arapaho and English, and tell what these items were and how they were used. And that was the basis for a virtual museum that was presented to the communities. And then from there, a documentary was filmed about it, and that came out in 2016 called What Was Ours.
Let's look at the next. Let's go on, Peter. Thank you. Yeah. So go ahead. Sorry.
And it raised questions about who owns the material culture of these Native nations. And this is a clip, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yeah, we can show the clip.
Oh, no, this clip doesn't play. It's just a still.
Oh, okay.
I'm not skilled enough with
but basically, this is one of the elders, his name, Philip McLeod. Unfortunately, he passed on, but he got to see these different items. But it was an interesting play because you had to bring tribal members to come look at their items that belong to them. And normally, I think that museums do these consultations sometimes as a check mark to say that they consulted with tribes. And basically, sometimes it's just to let the tribes look at the items. And I think museums, institutions get a little nervous when you start asking, well, we would like these items back. And during the film, one of the elders say that. And basically their reply is, well, it takes money, it takes effort, Well, back in 2018, I joined our tribe's preservation office. And from there, I was the collections manager, and I worked closely with the NAGPRA coordinator at the time, Euphna Soldier Wolf. And she would basically request an inventory list from each museum. And then she would go through it and kind of highlight the things that she felt had cultural significance to us as well. We got a list in 2018 that listed 4 human remains as listed as Arapaho. So Euphna strongly believed in the power of completing people's life cycles by bringing those ancestors home and reburying them. So she reached out and basically was like, hey, we would love to meet with you all. And we did in 2018 during the summer. And basically we said, well, we want to make a claim and we would love to do this. And they said, no, they don't belong to you all. And we asked, well, why? And they said, well, we believe that the box was mislabeled. So therefore, we don't think they belong to you all. And we contested it, and we kept going back to them and saying, we would love to talk this more. We would love to talk to this more. When I became chairman of the tribe in 2020, I revisited it again. And it was night and day. I think with the preservation part, a lot of these institutions and museums are just like, well, they're just the workers, we don't care. But when it came from being like, hello, my name is Jordan Dresden, I'm the chairman of the Northern Arapaho tribe, and I would love to talk to you about this. All of a sudden it was like, yes, okay, let's talk. But they still had the stance that they think that it didn't belong to us. And my reply was, so you're not confident in your cataloging system, which opens up a Pandora's box of saying, okay, well, if that's the case, then why then do all the items you say you have belong to those people? So we contested it. We went to their NAGPRA review committee, and in the end, we won our appeal. So this summer, finally, we're going to be getting back those 4 human remains, and we're going to rebury them. But, I think it was a very frustrating journey because, and this is something that Shannon could speak with, is that it's always the burdens put on the tribes. Because in a sense, it's like, how would the tribes know that all these items are in these institutions? They have to list them somehow. But then at the same time, it's like, when we get there, it's like, they always have to say, well, you got to prove that belongs to you all. Prove it. Prove that has cultural significance. Prove it. When in reality, it's like, why do we have to prove these things when in the end, those are our ancestors and those were taken from us mostly illegally? And that was just a really interesting play, but also how museums have this idea of ownership.
Yeah.
And that was just that was the toughest part about it all.
Yeah. Shannon, do you want to hop in there? And Peter, can we go on to the next slide? There we go. And if I'm not mistaken, I think those hands might belong to you, Jordan. Is that
Yes,
right?
they do.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, the Field Museum is a wonderful case study about how NAGPRA will not work if the intent of the institution is not to repatriate. So let me explain what that means. And Jordan, feel free to chime in where you saw that happening with the Field Museum. So let me give you a few facts that we know about the Field Museum. So the Field Museum currently has 1,300 native bodies in boxes in its facility. Alongside of those, there are, I think, close to 1,000 funerary belongings that belong with those ancestors. And all but 8 of those ancestors have information with them that can affiliate them with a native nation so that they're repatriated. So the process of NAGPRA as a human rights statute is really simple. Or as I like to explain it, it's simple. Museums often make it more complex. What's required from NAGPRA is that the museum use whatever information it has about a particular site where ancestors have come from. So if it's a location or a tribal affiliation, if that's the only information they have, along with tribal consultation, that's enough to make a reasonable determination that there's a shared group identity and repatriation can occur. The conversations and consultations should be that simple. So no institution should just say no. The institution, if they're saying no, they need to either prove they have a right of possession, or they need to show evidence that to justify their no. Because all you need to justify a yes is 51% a positive, reasonable determination that these ancestors are affiliated with Arapaho or another tribe. So it's clear from the information that was contained in their indexing and probably other information, right, Jordan, that they should have been culturally affiliated initially with your nation. Did they give any justification of why they said no?
Their view was that supposedly, and this is like the early 1900s, that the remains were put in a box called Arapaho Sundance. So their justification was, well, no, it had to have been Sundance items, and they think they just reused the box again. But then when it came time to catalog it, they were listed as Arapaho. So they were like, no, we just think in the end it was mislabeled because they were in the wrong box. And that's that. And then the box was destroyed. Nobody knows where that box is at. So it was just kind of like, no, we don't think they belong to you.
So it was more of their own oral tradition and storytelling versus any proper indexing or cataloging that they had done to confirm that, it sounds like. So what many institutions like the Field has done is the majority of their ancestors are labeled as culturally unidentifiable. And that just shows us that the Field Museum is not really working the simplicity of the act and working in consultation with Native nations to put forward repatriation. A little more information about the Field Museum is that many institutions like the Field Museum complain that this is a complex problem, that the repatriation is difficult, that it should be carefully undertaken, and we don't disagree with those things. And they all often declare that it's quite costly to undertake repatriation. So I want to make sure you're aware that the Field Museum was currently obtained a huge Mellon Foundation grant to redo their exhibits that hadn't been redone since the early 1950s. Those horrible dioramas. If you've ever been to the Field Museum before the new exhibits were put in place, were horrendous. But even though they had that federal legal responsibility under NAGPRA to repatriate, they put forward a lot of money to redo the face of the institution, while still only having one staff person handling NAGPRA issues. Even though over the since 1994, they've received $1.1 million in NAGPRA grants. So grants that were specific to support museums in working with Native nations to consult, affiliate, and repatriate. So Field has a history of not being very helpful with tribes, along with Jordan's documentary. There's another documentary regarding repatriation in the Field Museum called Stolen Spirits of Haida Gwaii. And even though the Haida Gwaii are in Canada and not within the United States, so that NAGPRA won't apply to them, that documentary clearly shows the difficulty that the Haida Gwaii had in getting repatriation of their ancestors. And the Field Museum refused to repatriate the funerary belongings that went with those ancestors. And so those are some difficult issues that many nations have to deal with when they're working with institutions like the Field, who claim that these ancestors are unidentifiable, and thereby it places the burden on the tribe to really have to prove and work to get Field to do the right thing. So I'm glad Jordan kept at it and used leverage of his position to help this repatriation move forward.
All right. You know what? We have so much material and so little time. So let's move on to the next slide. I want to make sure that we have time at the end for some questions. We've already got some great questions in that people have posted. So let's look next at an instance of working with the government to restitute and repatriate. And Jordan, you want to take it away?
Yeah, in 2017, the Northern Arapaho tribe became the first tribe to bring back children that died at the Carlisle Indian boarding school. And for a little context, Carlisle was one of the first boarding schools that was built in Pennsylvania. Lieutenant Pratt really believed that, it was important to take these kids away from their homes, which were predominantly in reservations on the western part, and he isolated them because it was the idea of stripping them from their identity. And as we've seen with the boarding school report that was released last year, there was a lot of mental, physical, emotional, and also sexual abuse that went on there. And a lot of the children died there. So Carlisle is a place that there's a cemetery. So there's 4 Arapahoes who actually are buried there, 1 girl and 3 boys. And in 2017, Yufna Soldier Wolf contacted, for generations, actually, her father and her grandpa were the first people who sent letters to Carlisle and say, we would love to bring back our children, because there's living descendants of these boys who are alive. These boys came from families that were predominantly chief families, Chief Black Hole, Chief Sharpnose, and Chief Friday. So those are very prominent families here on the reservation. So Yufna worked tirelessly to get affidavits and different things like that. And so they worked with the army to bring back them. But the key thing was that they didn't want to call it a repatriation. They kept saying they used the term internment. So that was a very huge process, and now that opened up the doors for other tribes to do it as well. And this year, actually, the Northern Arapaho tribe is going to go back because there was a fourth girl who was there, and UFNA couldn't find her direct descendants. And then the Army last year reached out to me, and we talked about it. And I said, well, as the chairman, I'm sure that I'm related to her somehow. Why don't I make the claim? And so they said, if you wanted to do that, so I did it, you know. And just the goal is, once again, bring these children home and settle that trauma that's happened at these places. So they were brought back home, and all of them are in different cemeteries here, but it's the ones that belong to their families. But most of all, I think that, and this was featured in a film called Home from School, The Children of Carlisle. But I think these were important, very important things to do, but also the Army was very difficult to work with because Carlisle still is an active military base. So we had to play within the rules of what they wanted. But that was always the key thing I thought about, was that it was called an internment, and it was kind of seen as a good thing that they were doing, when in reality, you know, these kids died there. So there's the context of that story.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Jordan.
And here we have a federal agency, the Army, who has burials on federal lands. And the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation absolutely applies for the intentional excavation of those ancestors to repatriate them and bring them home. Unfortunately, Army has refused to utilize NAGPRA as the process, and instead is forcing nations to go through their own process that they use to bring soldiers home from foreign wars, soldiers who have passed on in other countries, to bring them home, which requires affidavits and proof that you are a lineal descendant. And NAGPRA applies to more than just lineal descendants. And oftentimes, these children who were stolen from their families and brought to these boarding schools no longer have any lineal descendants. Or it is extremely burdensome to try to prove lineal descendancy according to the Army's needs. But NAGPRA allows for the affiliation, the connection with tribal affiliation, to be enough for repatriation to occur. But Army has refused to utilize federal law that they're bound by with these repatriations.
Right. All right, let's move on to black coal. And I think this is a.
So black coal
yeah.
is an interesting case because it's the rare example of somebody doing the right thing. You know, the key thing about NAGPRA is that it doesn't apply to private collectors. So back right before the pandemic hit in 2020, the tribe, we have a senior center that's called Black Coal, because Chief Black Coal was one of our greatest chiefs. And the cooks there got a cold call from this individual, and he's like, hey, I have your headdress that belongs to Chief Black Coal. I want to return it. And then it was this whole bunch of conversations, and then eventually came to us. And so I reached out and I was like, okay, what is it? And then can we get some provenance? Can we do that stuff? Can we get documentation? And he provided it all. And basically the story that was told to us was that, you know, his great grandpa was a dentist here at the early reservation when it was Warm Valley, and the Arapahoes were just now starting to settle here. And he was a dentist working on the different chiefs and the different tribal people. And then somehow he obtained the headdress of Chief Black Coal, and it just stayed in their family for generations. And it passed down to one of his grandsons, and his name's Temple. And Temple said it was just basically in his attic. And he got a special box made for it. They'd get it cleaned once in a while. But his wife kept being like, what are you going to do with this? Like, what are you going to do? And he said, finally, I said, I want to really return it to the tribes. I just want to do it. I don't want to give it to a museum. I don't want to do it. I just want to give it to them. And they're like, okay. So then he reached out. He said, come get it. Here's the dates. And that was it, and he just, it was a really powerful moment because we traveled with the delegation, including my dad, who was on the council at the time. And we were outside with it. And my dad's in the middle with the hat on, but, we did a cedering ceremony outside. And when we did it, this big gust of wind came up. And so we thought that was his way of saying he's glad to go home, So we brought him back to our tribe, and we had an event with our people to unveil him and show him. And I just thought that was a really powerful moment because I always wondered what he would think of us, because we're very different from how when he left, And I think maybe it's a way of him saying, okay, well, let's try to get our people together whole again. So that was a very good moment. But it's very scary to think about all the private collectors and what they have. And there's a huge black market of things that get sold. So that's that story. And it's one of my favorites.
Yeah, that's such a beautiful story. And I wish there were more of them to tell. So like I said earlier, NAGPRA provides really broad policy on what types of items are protected under NAGPRA, but only provided a remedy for public hands and public lands. It did not provide a remedy when dealers are commodifying and objectifying and selling Native cultural heritage. It did not provide a remedy or support for those who want to voluntarily repatriate. And sometimes those folks like Temple here, who had good intentions, sometimes it's difficult for them to even know what to do when they have such a precious item that they'd like to return to Native nations. So we see about 7,000, we watch about 7,000 sensitive cultural heritage items every year are sold at auction domestically and internationally. Recently, there was a new piece of legislation called the Safeguarding Tribal Objects of Patrimony Act that President Biden signed at the end of last year that prevents the trafficking of Native cultural heritage overseas. So any kind of dealer or holder of a cultural heritage item, such as the headdress here, would need to show proof that they have clear title to those items, and that information is then passed on to Native nations in case, for whatever reason, the holder is not giving the full truth about where the item came from. So this is really a success story. We've seen items come up for sale at auction. For example, there was a wampum belt for sale that belonged to Mohawk and the Haudenosaunee Confederacy back in, I believe, 2009. And it took 10 years to have that belt returned finally to the Mohawk people. So sometimes the process takes a while. Quite often, private collectors and dealers are scared. They're worried that they're violating law, which they may be. Like I said, there's about 25 federal laws that apply, but there's also state as well as tribal laws, because if you consider there's 574 federally recognized tribes and about 400 other state recognized and other tribes, bands, and communities within the US, Alaska, and Canada, and Hawaii, not including Canada. Each one of those tribes has their own governance system and bodies of law. And many of those tribes declare they have inherent sovereignty over their cultural heritage, regardless of where that cultural heritage has found. So really glad that we see efforts like this to return cultural heritage items.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, you know, we have just about 20 minutes, so let's take the slides down and give us all some time for questions. I'm going to start with the questions that are already posted, but please feel free to post whatever's on your mind. Our Associate Director, Angela Labrador, has asked, going back to the field example, if there's a body in a collection that is truly unidentifiable, is there a respectful way to handle those remains should the institution opt for reburial? Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Jordan, have you consulted with any institutions where there was no information whatsoever?
Yeah, actually with the University of Wyoming, there's a river near, I think it's called Fort Bridger, but basically there was kind of like a site where different battles occurred, but they think there's a huge mass grave there. And then over time, the river was eroding, and then all these remains were just kind of being exposed, So the tribes took it upon themselves to all talk and decided to say, okay, well, since they're located in Wyoming, why don't the Northern Arapaho tribe take the lead and they rebury them? So the University of Wyoming was really good to work with that, because in the end, I think they saw that too, was like, well, we got to do something with this, and also we can't hold them forever. And our view was, well, let's just bury them and let's just do the right thing rather than just having them sit there. So that was something that we did with them.
Yeah, that's great. But even that example, you have geographic information to help connect Native nations who are connected to those locations in Wyoming. So there was information there. There are times when there's absolutely no information, and all the institution has is human remains that are known to be Native American. There have been institutions like the Denver Museum of Nature and Science who have taken ancestors that had no geographic information, no catalog information, no associated funerary objects to kind of help identify the culture that's connected to the ancestor, and essentially sent out requests to consult to all 574 federally recognized tribes, and started working with those that were interested to find a plan of action to return these ancestors to the ground to continue their journey. And that effort was successful, and those ancestors have been returned. So NAGPRA does provide a process, even when there's no information, or even when there's not a federally recognized tribe that's connected to the ancestor.
So we have another question. Many of the students in our program are fairly early in their museum careers, and they may not yet be in positions to make big decisions about what a museum does with its collections. So we have a question that says, how can a member of the museum staff, especially one who is not a decision maker, be a good advocate for repatriation?
I think the key thing is being friendly to Native tribes when they go there. I think, when we went to the Field Museum, it was very different from the first time I went, which there was a film crew there. So of course, everybody's being like, welcome, we love this. The second time, basically nobody approached us, we basically waited. There was one Native staff member there who was there, but she didn't even know we were coming. She didn't even know. And then she was like, oh, I would have met you all, so that's just the key thing, is like, have those conversations and be welcoming to them as well, as opposed to when you go there, it's like sometimes you just feel like a foreigner. and like you're being treated as, well, not even a foreigner, like a trespasser, you know. And that's very hard for that, because you're just like, we're just here, we're just trying to get this done, and we're just trying to walk each other home at the end of a dark night, you know. But it's just that was difficult. I would say that.
Yeah, there's also a process under NAGPRA, the civil penalty process, that acts like a whistleblower opportunity. So if an individual is in an institution and see that their institution is not complying with NAGPRA, is not protecting the collection, or not following the processes and procedures of NAGPRA, they can make a civil penalty complaint, which is quite easy to do. Any person who has information of an institution that's violating NAGPRA can make a simple complaint and provide it to the National NAGPRA program. And just so you know what their website is, I'm going to put it in the chat so that everyone can go check out the National NAGPRA program and learn more about the civil penalty process. In addition to that, I really like what you said, Jordan, about just being friendly and respectful and providing the space and for the needs of the nations that are visiting. This is an emotional process, and many tribes often see it as an opportunity to thank the institution for taking care of the ancestors and cultural items, and now it's time for them to come home. But other times, Native nations are still hurting and have not had good relationships with that institution and others. And so they may not be friendly to the process and just want the ancestors back. And I hope that institutions and museum staff can meet the Native nations wherever they are and go through the process hand in hand as best as possible with Native nations.
That's great. Thank you. We have a couple more questions. One asks about the arguments that museums make against returning objects, against returning ancestors and funerary objects, and I think that's when I started my own journey of understanding this, which is I'm still very, very early in it, but I had to do a lot of thinking about what does it mean to return something, because all that we hear about and when we learn to work in museums is you keep this thing forever and ever and ever, and it's always at 72 degrees or whatever it's at, and it has to be in the right humidity, and you have to keep it because it's a solemn promise to the public that you are holding on to the heritage. And so then this comes in, and the idea that no, actually not that, no, you don't get to hold this forever. And I think that really turns on its head a lot of the way that we have defined what museums mean and what museums are supposed to do. And I think maybe that is where these arguments against restitution come from. And I wonder what your experience has been. I mean, how do you answer that question? How do you think about this in terms of sort of there's the broader conversation or the broader understanding around what Native nations, what belongs to Native nations and what was taken from them. And then there's another conversation about why are museums the way they are?
I think a key thing is just the fact that to return them is to admit fault as well, because I think museums have to start looking at the fact that probably I would say the majority of the stuff that belonged to Indigenous people were taken unethically.
Yeah.
So you got to acknowledge that stuff. Like, with case in point with the Carlisle, you know, when one of the boys, we went to dig up his grave, you know, when we did, we found in the end that he wasn't even in that grave. There was two, he would have been about 11. Instead, there was two bodies in that same grave who were turned out to be teenagers. So it was this big mystery of like, wait, what? You know? So I think it's just gonna cover all these different things that as you go along. And I think that's a really tough conversation. And one I really credit for us having these conversations with museums is the movie Black Panther. You know, there's that really great scene when he's in that museum and he just says it. He just like, oh, this stuff was stolen, you know?
Yeah.
And boom, it started a conversation.
Yeah.
So I think to admit that is to say, yeah, we didn't get this the best way.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the mission of any museum or public institution is to educate the public and of course, curate these items in perpetuity forever. And that's their responsibility. When institutions actually started working with Native nations, that's when they first started really learning what was in their collections. And so all of the arguments they made that NAGPRA would wipe out their collections or would injure the institution's mission and goals have been completely erased from the wonderful collaborative and consultative relationships that many institutions have followed without a problem. It's only been, there's about 20 institutions, 20 museums and federal agencies that currently hold about half of the ancestors that have been notified to the National NAGPRA program, have been put in notices to the National NAGPRA program through inventories. So the public mission of the museum is much better when working hand in hand with tribes and better understanding. And like Jordan said, this is really putting museums and institutions, forcing them to look in the mirror at themselves, because they are supposed to be using industry best practices to care for their collections, to inventory their collections. And now what we hear from them and the reasons why they're unable to comply with NAGPRA is because they never did the things that they were supposed to do to begin with, being a public institution. And I always say, look, every academic institution, library, little historical society or museum, they're all an entity under law. And as an entity, whether it's a 501c3 or a state corporation or some other type of legal entity, they have legal obligations. And this is a major one. This is a federal law that they must comply with. And so quite often the excuses of we don't have the money, we don't have the time, we don't have the capacity is really a failure to prioritize these federal legal obligations. That is part of the institution's mission, regardless, along with public education, is to follow the law.
Yeah. Thank you. We have one more question that's a little bit different, and it's a great issue to raise. Given the sacred nature of these items, once they are repatriated, how does the Native American community feel about leaving behind a digital record of the objects in the museum? As sacred items, should these not be recorded in this way?
I think that speaks about the power of tribal sovereignty. And when I first got on council, I remember somebody told me something I never forgot. They were like, remember, when you step into the room, It's like, it's the same way that the United States is having conversations with Africa, having conversations with Egypt. They're like, you represent those nations as well, you know? So I think it's the same way. So that speaks about the power of consultation, because to say, okay, yeah, we're all okay with it is not. You know, each individual tribe has their own thoughts and ideas. I know for a fact the Zunis really strongly believe against replicas, because they believe that when you make a replica, it's going to hold the same power the original had. So, you know, there's different case studies where they talk about those things. So that would be up to nation and nation.
Right. And I think it's important that we use the appropriate language as well when we're talking about this. There is not a Native American community. So the Native American community doesn't exist. And I think we should recognize that Native nations are sovereign and separate governments with their own laws, their own governance structure, and they're the ones who get to say whether a digital record of items is okay for an institution to maintain or not. They're the ones who get to say whether or not they want research done on their ancestors' human remains for scientific purposes. They're the ones who must have control of the decision-making in these issues. And so I encourage everyone when they're working with Native nations to remember that they're sovereign, that they're governments. This is not a community. We're not talking about, though Native peoples are marginalized peoples, they have a special status under federal law, which is described as a political government-to-government relationship with the United States, which is different than any other group in the United States. And so that must be respected through the NAGPRA process.
All right. Well, it is 7:58, and I think that it's time to wrap things up. Thank you so much for joining us, Jordan from Wyoming and Shannon from Maryland. It has been, you know, there's just so much to think about and there's so much to learn. And we are so fortunate to have colleagues like the two of you who are out doing this important work and willing to teach us. So thank you so much for joining us. And thank you to everyone who logged in. This will be available online if you need to check back for a reference. And with that, we'll see you the next time. Thank you.